while the world was watching warships, while cameras tracked destroyers pushing through a 21-mile corridor, while politicians argued over blockades and diplomats flew home from Islamabad with nothing in their hands, while oil markets convulsed and gas prices climbed past $4 and Asia's factories began calculating how long their reserves would last, Saudi Arabia did something quiet, something that required no navy, no ultimatum, no press conference, and no permission from anyone. Something that had been 45 years in preparation for exactly this moment. Something that, with a single announcement on April 12, 2026, began pulling the teeth out of the most dangerous energy weapon any nation has deployed against the global economy in modern history. Not a weapon, not a threat, not a fleet, a pipeline. And what Saudi Arabia just did with that pipeline is one of the most extraordinary strategic moves in the history of global energy. It changed the entire balance of the greatest oil crisis of the 21st century. It directly undermined the core of Iran's leverage in this conflict. It exposed a 45-year preparation that most of the world had either forgotten or never knew existed. And almost nobody's talking about it. Stay with us. Because the story of what Saudi Arabia built, why it built it, what Iran did when it realized what was happening, and what it means for the future of global energy is the most important story nobody is covering in this conflict. And by the end of this, you will understand not just what happened, but why the Strait of Hormuz may never again be the ultimate trump card that Tehran believed it to be. To understand what Saudi Arabia just did, you need to understand what Iran did first. On February 28, 2026, the United States and Israel launched coordinated strikes on Iranian territory. The world paused. Markets froze. And before the smoke had even settled, Iran made the move it had been preparing for decades. It reached for the one lever it knew could send shockwaves across the entire planet. Within hours of the conflict beginning, Iran effectively asserted control over the Strait of Hormuz, a corridor that normally carries nearly 20 million barrels of oil every single day. Roughly 1/5 of all global seaborne supply was suddenly paralyzed. Ship traffic that once averaged 150 vessels per day collapsed to 4 or 5. A 97% reduction in maritime traffic almost overnight. The world felt it immediately. Oil surged toward $120 per barrel. American gas prices climbed past $4 per gallon. Factory input costs across Asia surged as energy supply uncertainty compounded into manufacturing cost increases. European energy bills spiked. The MSCI Asia-Pacific Index erased all of 2026's gains in a single month. Analysts warned that if the closure persisted, prices could reach $200 per barrel. Iran had played the card it spent decades building, the card it believed no adversary would dare force. And Saudi Arabia? Saudi Arabia had spent those same decades building something Iran never fully accounted for. Go back to the early 1980s, the Iran-Iraq War. Tankers being attacked in the Persian Gulf, oil shipments disrupted. Saudi Arabia, already the world's largest crude exporter, watching its revenue streams threatened by a conflict it did not start and could not control. The Saudi leadership made a decision in those years that would take decades to fully appreciate. They would build a way out. Not a diplomatic solution, not a military deterrent, a physical, steel, irreversible bypass. A pipeline so massive and so strategically positioned that if the Strait of Hormuz ever truly closed, Saudi Arabia could still get its oil to the world without a single tanker needing to pass through Iranian-controlled waters. The East-West pipeline, known to the industry as the Petroline, is 1,200 kilometers of steel pipe crossing the entire Arabian Peninsula. Running from the Abqaiq oil processing facility in Saudi Arabia's eastern province, where the kingdom's legendary fields sit beneath the desert floor, all the way westward across the country to the Red Sea port of Yanbu on the opposite coast. A highway for crude oil that has absolutely nothing to do with the Strait of Hormuz. That passes through no contested waters. That no Iranian missile battery can close. That no IRGC patrol boat can charge a toll to use. That no mine drifting in the Gulf can threaten. When it was built, it had a capacity of 5 million barrels per day. Impressive, but not enough to replace the 20 million that normally flowed through Hormuz. Saudi Arabia knew this, and Saudi Arabia had already planned for it. On February 28, 2026, the moment the strikes on Iran began, and it became clear that Hormuz would be contested, Saudi Arabia activated the Petroline immediately, within hours, not days. Not after a cabinet meeting and a strategic review, hours. And that was only the beginning. Here's the detail that makes what Saudi Arabia did genuinely extraordinary rather than simply impressive. The Petroline, as originally built, moved 5 million barrels per day. But running parallel to it, sharing much of the same infrastructure corridor across the Arabian desert, were natural gas liquids pipelines, systems designed to carry ethane, propane, and butane from the eastern province's gas processing facilities to the petrochemical plants at Yanbu on the Red Sea coast. Saudi Arabia converted those pipelines to carry crude oil. This was not an improvised decision made in a crisis. The engineering work began in 2019 after drone strikes on the Abqaiq facility demonstrated that Saudi oil infrastructure was vulnerable to precision attack. For 6 years, Saudi engineers prepared a conversion plan that could be executed rapidly when needed. When February 28, 2026 arrived, the plan was ready. On March 11, 2026, just 11 days after the war began, the full conversion was completed. The Petroline's effective capacity jumped from 5 million barrels per day to 7 million. 11 days from the outbreak of war to the full activation of the most important piece of energy bypass infrastructure on the planet. By late March, crude exports flowing through Yanbu had reached approximately 5 million barrels per day, with an additional 700,000 to 900,000 barrels per day of refined products also moving westward. A senior Gulf energy executive watching all of this unfold summarized what the world was only beginning to understand. In hindsight, the East-West pipeline looks like a genius masterstroke. 7 million barrels per day of Saudi crude flowing westward across the desert to the Red Sea, away from the Strait of Hormuz, away from Iran's control, away from the mines, the drones, the IRGC patrol boats, and the toll booths the Iranian parliament had legislated into existence in March 2026. Every barrel flowing through that pipeline was a barrel that weakened the leverage Iran had spent decades and billions of dollars building. Iran understood exactly what Saudi Arabia was doing, and Iran could not allow it to continue unchallenged. The counterattack came in early April, shortly after a 2-week ceasefire between the United States and Iran was declared on April 9th. Iranian strikes targeted multiple energy-related infrastructure sites across Saudi Arabia, including facilities in Riyadh, the eastern province, and Yanbu Industrial City. One strike damaged a pumping station on the east-west pipeline, 700,000 barrels per day of capacity, gone. One strike on one facility on a 1,200-kilometer pipeline, and a significant portion of Saudi Arabia's entire bypass capacity was suddenly offline. Iran was sending the clearest possible message. We know what you are doing. We know exactly what it costs us. And we will not let you do it. The message was received, and Saudi Arabia's response to that message is the part of this story that deserves the most attention. Saudi Arabia's Ministry of Energy confirmed on April 12, 2026, the full pumping capacity on the east-west pipeline had been restored to 7 million barrels per day. The rapid restoration of pipeline operations was achieved through coordinated technical and operational response measures. Iran attacked one of the most critical pieces of energy infrastructure on Earth. Saudi Arabia restored full capacity in under a week. This was not luck. This was preparation. Aramco had prepositioned spare parts at strategic points along the pipeline's entire 1,200-kilometer length. Engineering teams had rehearsed exactly this scenario. Emergency protocols had been developed and refined over years of contingency planning. The speed of the restoration is the most revealing indicator of how seriously Saudi Arabia had prepared for exactly the threat Iran just executed. 7 million barrels per day back online. April 12, 2026, the same day Trump announced the American blockade, the same day peace talks in Islamabad officially collapsed, the same day oil surged above $100 per barrel. While the entire world was watching the naval standoff in the Strait, Saudi Arabia quietly announced that its pipeline, attacked and disrupted, was back at maximum output. Now understand what 7 million barrels per day actually means, because the numbers here are everything. Before this war, the Strait of Hormuz carried approximately 20 million barrels per day of crude and petroleum products. Saudi Arabia's 7 million barrels per day through the Petroline represents approximately 35% of that pre-closure volume. Significant, critical, but not a complete replacement. The UAE's Abu Dhabi crude oil pipeline adds to the picture. The ADCOP system allows UAE crude exports to bypass the strait via the Fujairah terminal on the Gulf of Oman. Analysts estimate the 5 million barrel per day pipeline was operating at 71% utilization during the crisis, with ADNOC able to raise throughput to approximately 8 million barrels per day under emergency conditions. Add Saudi Arabia and the UAE together, and you have approaching 9 million barrels per day of bypass capacity on the crude side. Still less than half of what Hormuz normally carries, still leaving an enormous gap. And that gap falls hardest on the countries with no bypass options at all. Iraq has no comparable bypass infrastructure. Its proposed Basra-Aqaba pipeline through Jordan has been in planning stages for over a decade without breaking ground. Kuwait is entirely dependent on the strait for its approximately 5 million barrels per day of exports. Qatar's LNG, which supplies 12 to 14% of Europe's liquefied natural gas and enormous quantities to Asia, has no pipeline bypass equivalent. Gas cannot be rerouted across the desert. It requires liquefaction plants, specialized tankers, and regasification terminals at the receiving end. Qatar's Ras Laffan facility, the largest LNG complex on the planet, is unlikely to return to full capacity before the end of August at the earliest, with Iranian strikes having destroyed 2 of its production trains and removed a significant percentage of its export capacity. The LNG crisis, unlike the crude oil crisis, has no quick bypass solution, and there is no Saudi petroline equivalent for gas. But even for crude oil, the bypass solution faces a constraint that the pipeline's capacity numbers alone do not reveal. Getting oil out of the pipeline is only half the battle. Getting it onto ships and out to the world requires port capacity, tankers, and physical loading infrastructure built to handle the volume. Yanbu is an industrial city. It was never designed to be the primary export terminal for the world's largest oil producer under wartime emergency conditions. It was built to handle a fraction of what it is now being asked to do. In March 2026, Yanbu handled 47 very large crude carrier loadings. Its pre-war monthly average was 11 to 12. A fourfold increase in loading operations compressed every piece of port infrastructure to its operational limit. Pilot boats, tugboats, berths, cranes, scheduling systems, crew availability, everything running at maximum capacity simultaneously. The result is visible in the numbers. The pipeline delivered approximately 7 million barrels per day westward to Yanbu. The port actually loaded approximately 4 million barrels per day onto departing tankers in late March, a gap of nearly 5 million barrels per day between what the pipeline can deliver and what the port can currently ship. The port bottleneck is the binding constraint on Saudi Arabia's bypass capacity right now, not the pipeline itself. Fleets of supertankers, each capable of carrying 2 million barrels, are queuing off the Red Sea coast, waiting their turn at berths that are already occupied by vessels still loading. Saudi Arabia knows this is a bottleneck. And Saudi Arabia, operating in the same strategic tradition that built the petrolane 45 years ago and expanded it at the outbreak of this conflict, is already working on solving it. The crisis is now reshaping not just geopolitics, but the physical map of Middle Eastern energy infrastructure in ways that will outlast this conflict by generations. Saudi Arabia is actively examining whether to expand the east-west pipeline's capacity further or build entirely new routes. One serious option under consideration involves reviving U.S.-led plans for the India, Middle East, Europe Economic Corridor, the IMEC. Additional export terminals along the Red Sea coast, including at the NEOM project area on Saudi Arabia's northwestern coast, are under active discussion. NEOM, the vast futuristic megaproject that was supposed to be about tourism, technology, and smart cities, it is now being evaluated as a potential emergency oil export terminal. The crisis is redirecting one of the most ambitious national development projects in history toward immediate energy security needs. The UAE is exploring the possibility of a second pipeline to Fujairah to boost its own bypass capacity. Saudi officials are examining corridors linking Iraqi oil fields to the Mediterranean via Jordan or Turkey. The India, Middle East, Europe Economic Corridor, first announced at the G20 summit in New Delhi in September 2023 and subsequently stalled by regional politics, has gained an urgency in 2026 that no amount of diplomatic persuasion could previously generate. Replicating the east-west pipeline today would cost at least $5 billion. Multi-country corridor projects exceeding current planning parameters could cost $20 billion or more. But a senior advisor at the Atlantic Council told the Financial Times what the investment community is now beginning to internalize. I am sensing a shift from hypotheticals into operational reality. That shift, from hypothetical to operational, from conference presentation to funded construction, from think tank report to engineering procurement contract, is the most significant long-term consequence of what Iran did when it closed the Strait of Hormuz. It has made every alternative route, every bypass pipeline, every grand corridor across the Middle East urgently necessary in a way that decades of planning and advocacy could never achieve. The Strait of Hormuz was always open. Why spend billions on alternatives to something that worked? Now, it does not work. And the alternatives are not hypothetical anymore. They are urgent. They are funded. They will be built. Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu articulated the logic that is now driving infrastructure decisions across the entire region. Long-term solutions include rerouting energy pipelines westward across Saudi Arabia to the Red Sea and Mediterranean, bypassing Iran's geographic choke point, he stated, emphasizing that infrastructure solutions are more sustainable than military options. Infrastructure over military action. That is a striking statement from a government that has been conducting one of the most intense bombing campaigns in recent Middle Eastern history. And yet, the logic is undeniable, and it is the same logic Saudi Arabia has been operating on since the early 1980s. You can bomb Iranian missile batteries. You can send destroyers into the strait. You can clear mines and impose blockades, but as long as Iran sits on the northern shore of those 21 miles of water, as long as the Hormuz corridor passes within range of Iranian coastal weapons, the underlying threat never fully disappears. It can be suppressed. It can be degraded. It cannot be permanently eliminated through military means alone. The only solution that permanently removes Iran's leverage is to make Hormuz less necessary, to build alternatives so robust that the strait can be contested, even closed, without triggering a global economic catastrophe, To reach a world where a decision made in Tehran about the Strait of Hormuz is consequential but not existential for the global economy, that is what Saudi Arabia was building toward for 45 years. That is what this crisis has accelerated from a generational project into an urgent construction priority. But intellectual honesty requires confronting the full picture, because 7 million barrels per day through a pipeline, as extraordinary as it is, does not solve everything. Saudi Arabia sacrificed something significant to achieve this bypass capacity. The natural gas liquids pipelines converted to carry crude were originally the feedstock supply for the kingdom's petrochemical sector, including SABIC's major operations at Yanbu. By diverting those pipelines to crude transport, Saudi Arabia has effectively suspended its NGL export capacity for the duration of the bypass operation. Saudi Arabia's Vision 2030 strategy, the kingdom's ambitious plan to diversify its economy beyond raw crude exports by building world-scale petrochemical and manufacturing industries, depends fundamentally on natural gas liquids as its industrial feedstock. Those liquids are now being redirected to carry crude oil instead. The long-term economic diversification strategy is being directly subordinated to the immediate crisis. The kingdom is making a calculated trade, sacrifice a portion of its future economic development agenda to protect its present revenue stream and its role as the global energy supplier of last resort. It is a trade Saudi Arabia has made before. It reflects the same pragmatic, long-term strategic calculation that built the Petroline in the first place. And then there's the Bab el-Mandeb problem. The southern exit of the Red Sea, the choke point that tankers loading at Yanbu must pass through to reach Asian and European markets. The East-West pipeline provides a critical alternative to Hormuz, but it shifts pressure to a different choke point, a corridor that Iran has previously threatened to target through Houthi proxy forces if the conflict continues to escalate. A bypass that routes around one vulnerable strait only matters if the oil can safely transit the next one. The Bab el-Mandeb is narrower than Hormuz at some points and equally susceptible to disruption by determined asymmetric actors with access to drone and missile capabilities. And then there's the most sobering constraint of all, the one that even a fully restored Petroline at maximum capacity cannot address. Even if the Strait of Hormuz were to open tomorrow, completely and unconditionally, with every mine cleared and every Iranian commitment honored, the global energy system would not immediately return to normal. The tanker fleet that moved through Hormuz 150 times per day does not sit waiting at the entrance ready to resume operations the moment an all clear is issued. Ship operators, cargo insurers, and shipping companies make decisions based on risk assessments that are not instantly revised by a ceasefire announcement. The institutional memory of vessels being attacked in the strait, of mines being encountered where none were charted, of insurance being unavailable at any price, does not evaporate with a diplomatic statement. Experts across the shipping and energy industries have reached a consistent conclusion. Even in the best-case scenario where the strait fully reopens today, it would likely take until July 2026 for oil flows through Hormuz to return to anything approaching pre-conflict normal. 3 months from now. 3 months in which the East-West pipeline must continue carrying the weight of the global energy system on 1,100 kilometers of steel pipe crossing the Arabian desert. This is the double-edged reality of what Saudi Arabia has achieved. It built something extraordinary. It activated it with remarkable speed. It repaired it with impressive efficiency after Iran attacked it, and in doing so, it created a new and significant concentration of risk, a single pipeline through which a substantial portion of the world's remaining accessible crude oil flows, infrastructure that Iran has already demonstrated it knows how to locate and strike. A choke point of a different kind, not a sea lane, but a steel pipe. Not 21 miles wide, but a single target in the desert. Saudi Arabia is not finished, and it is not acting alone. Pakistan has emerged as a key diplomatic actor in a new four-nation coalition alongside Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and Turkey. This grouping has been active in attempting to broker a framework that could end the military confrontation and provide conditions for the strait's genuine reopening. Trump has acknowledged Pakistan's mediation role publicly, crediting Islamabad's outreach with having contributed to the temporary pauses in escalation that have allowed diplomatic channels to remain at least partially open. Saudi Arabia is simultaneously building pipelines, loading tankers at 4 times normal port capacity, repairing infrastructure after Iranian strikes, and sitting at diplomatic tables advocating for a resolution that makes all of the emergency infrastructure unnecessary. It is pursuing military, economic, and diplomatic tracks simultaneously with the same methodical patience that characterized the original construction of the Petroline 4 decades ago. Step back from the individual details and look at what this moment actually reveals about Saudi Arabia's strategic position. When Iran closed the Strait of Hormuz on March 2, 2026, it believed it had activated the ultimate economic weapon, the card that holds the entire global energy system hostage, the move that forces every dependent economy to pressure Washington to stand down. What it had not fully calculated was that Saudi Arabia had spent 45 years building a bypass, that the bypass had been expanded and prepared for rapid deployment, that Saudi engineering teams could restore damaged pumping stations in under a week, that Yanbu's port could be stretched to 4 times its normal loading rate, and that the crisis would not just activate a pipeline, but accelerate a multi-billion-dollar transformation of the entire regional energy infrastructure map. Iran's closure of Hormuz was supposed to give Tehran maximum leverage over the global economy. What it has done instead is accelerate the construction of every alternative that makes Hormuz less relevant. Every week the strait remains closed is another week of urgent investment in bypass infrastructure. Every Iranian strike on Saudi energy facilities is another argument for redundancy. Every disruption is another data point that the $20 billion investment in permanent alternative corridors is not a luxury, but a necessity. Iran is, inadvertently, funding the acceleration of its own strategic irrelevance. The United States sent destroyers into the strait and called it a blockade. Iran issued final warnings over radio and launched drones at pumping stations. But Saudi Arabia built a way around the entire problem 45 years ago, maintained it through decades of relative peace, expanded it with 6 years of quiet engineering preparation, and activated it within hours when the world needed it most, restored it within days when Iran attacked it, and is now planning its permanent expansion with urgency that no amount of peacetime advocacy could have generated. That is not the response of a country caught off guard. That is the response of a country that understood, longer and more clearly than almost anyone in the world, that the Strait of Hormuz was always a vulnerability, and that the only real, permanent, irreversible power does not come from controlling a choke point. It comes from building the world that no longer needs one. Do not look away.